inquiry model and the efficacy of the model. We're going to talk about centering emotions in e-learning, looking at, if you're familiar with the model, you'll know that it's a Venn diagram and that there's some overlaps. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to introduce you to the facilitator self-assessment tool. And if you haven't had a chance to download that from the documents that are attached to the presentation. So then we're going to talk about the facilitator self-assessment tool. And if you haven't had a chance to download it from the documents, it's actually the first link. The second link is a mistake from a different presentation altogether. Then we're going to conclude with some next steps. I'm a pretty flexible facilitator, so if you want to pop open your mic at any time, I'll probably recognize that your mic is open and be able to ask you to interject with your question. But I was going to start with just a question for the chat, or your mic. Doesn't matter now because we are quite a small group. What is it about the session title or the abstract that made you interested in joining today? What's your interest in emotions in e-learning?
On my part, my interest is I've been dealing with a long-term concussion while I've been studying online myself, and so I've been finding it really interesting to just see how emotions really have an impact on the things that can aggravate that concussion, and as a result, you know, one of my sort of goals has been putting more sort of wellness and screen break activities into my online courses. And I'm really curious, like your title really captured, like, because there's so few people that I've seen that have been sort of talking about this idea of emotions and e-learning and that sort of realm.
Awesome, thanks, Erica. Did anybody else want to add anything by voice or in the chat about why you might have joined today?
I will. So I'm a faculty developer at our institution, and to kind of echo what Erica was saying, especially with the transition, I guess, to remote learning, is that integration of emotions and recognizing that all of these people are in all of these different situations. And I think it's super important that we consider that when we're teaching face-to-face or in this e-learning context as well.
Thanks, Kelly. And Danny's adding that they work in curriculum development in an open learning unit, so want to apply wellness and emotional support considerations. That's awesome consideration. And May has been following Deborah's work for a few years and can't wait to hear the development. So no pressure, hey May. Okay, great. Well, I'm glad that you all came, and I'm glad that emotions matter to you as much as they matter to me. My name is Deborah Dell, and I'm a doctoral student at Athabasca University. But I'm also someone who's worked in addictions and mental health for the better part of my life. And so a long time ago, I used to think that my work world and my student world were quite separate. I used to say that I worked with unlearning in my mental health and addictions work and with learning in the other work. And I realize now they were much more blended than I ever realized, and that in order to learn, you have to be prepared to unlearn sometimes, and that unlearning can be extremely emotional. And that's kind of part of what got me interested in this subject. I've been studying emotions, not academically, but through my practical work for many, many years. And during my very first experience as an online learner, I became, it was transformative for me, because I realized that there was a different way of teaching and learning. I like to joke that when I did my undergrad degree, I did it so reluctantly that I actually realized after about 1 week that nobody would notice if I wasn't there. So I didn't go to school. I actually just read the lecture notes and the textbooks and did all the tests and the work. I didn't actually attend school in order to get my first undergrad degree because I found it so incredibly boring and not useful, because everything that was being, every credit that was being applied to either the textbook or the lecture notes. So it was a big joke that, you know, I did a distance learning degree before there was a distance learning degree available. But when I found my first distance learning actual degree, and I experienced community of inquiry as a learner, I was transformed with the idea that, one, learning didn't come from a single expert, that there was distributed cognition going on, and that everybody's voice in the classroom mattered. And that's what really drew me to this model. So are you all familiar with the community of inquiry framework or model? You can just say in the chat if you are familiar with it, and that will help me decide how deep I go with the background. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so some good familiarity. Go ahead and say any more you want about your familiarity while I talk, and I'll check back there. So those of you who know about it know that it's a 20-year-old distance education framework. It was built from text-based communication, computer-mediated communication. It's built on a real collaborative constructivist philosophy of learning. And in the 20 years, there's been lots of research in many contexts. There's several publications lately that have called it the most cited framework in distance learning. And it's made up of essentially these three presences that are on the screen, the red, the blue, and the green, that harmonize to support an educational experience. Of course, anything that has a research agenda has critics. So there's been many calls for additions, adaptations, especially to include different things like learner presence, emotional presence, regulation presence. And more recently, there's been a research agenda focused on emotional presence. And my own doctoral dissertation is based on emotional presence. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about the 20 years. Starting with the emergence of the model in 2000, there was a series of articles that established the social presence. There was a focus beginning in 2001, really focused on the importance of practical inquiry model, the cognitive presence part of the model. The 2001 to 2007, we're calling the validation period, because that's when lots of studies were done about instrumentation and designing things that could help measure was there the three presences going on in a community of inquiry. And then in 2008, the operationalization period. And that was really about beginning to look for and accelerating the research trends around community of inquiry. In 2009, this is the beginning of the learning years, where really the focus went back to, well, if learning is meant to be the core of the model, how are we looking at the real construction of learning, and adding the construct of metacognition to the model came in and around that time. And then in 2010, we're the beginning of all the calls for adaptations. As people got to know the model more deeply, they were really doing, you know, what researchers and practitioners should do, is teasing it apart and trying to think what's missing within these presences. And then in 2012, you start to see the emergence of people starting to say, well, we're talking about cognitive, social, and teaching presence, but where's the emotions? Where's the feeling? And now 2020 and beyond, there's been a revitalization, of course, because of COVID. People who never would have had an interest in distance learning are suddenly very interested in distance learning. And that's called for, you know, every day, the Google alerts about community of inquiry is probably about 10 publications a day right now. So there's a real focus on the construct revalidation, looking at the different elements of it, and also another real focus in practical pedagogy. So that's, I hope, what we're going to do a bit today. So essentially, I won't go through this too detailed because you're so familiar with the model, but those who are familiar with it always know the main presences, the cognitive presence, which is the extent to which learners are able to construct meaning and use reflection and critical discourse to approach the course content. And then there's teaching presence, which really the definition is it's a means to an end to support and enhance the social and the cognitive presence for the purpose of realizing educational outcomes. And social presence, the ability to identify with a group and communicate openly in a trusting atmosphere. And you can see when you look across each of the presences, there's words that very definitely are emotional. Things like critical discourse, sustained reflection, social, being social, and developing trust, effective relationships, projecting your personality. All of those things have sort of an emotional gravity to them. In terms of efficacy for the model, there's been lots of studies that report that it is a good model, that the constructs and the instruments align with what's being studied, that when students experience good teaching presence, that affects the emergence of social presence in the Shea and the Gennaro article, and also that the concepts do provide guidance for the process of online and blended learning, and that they provide a support that leads to deep and meaningful learning. So, I mean, it would take it would take 100 slides to point to all the efficacy studies. But with this one, we were going to really point out in detail because in terms of becoming an online instructor, one of the first things is that awareness is key. And so those of you that are here are already aware of the model. But in this particular study by Smaldy and colleagues, it was found that only 20% of those who were teaching online were aware of the framework, but 90% viewed the framework once they learned about it as significant in building an online course. But 70% didn't use any framework at all. And that's kind of, I mean, certainly into the pandemic. I don't know if you know people who were, at face-to-face courses. I had a son in a face-to-face university, and when the pandemic hit, for the first, I'm going to say 5-6 weeks of his online studies, his professors didn't get there. They didn't actually make it to the classes. So the students were often alone in the classroom as the instructors were trying to figure out the technology to get there. And then after that, it became very much just putting the transmission-based lectures into videos. So it's not surprising that 70% of people in this course weren't aware of a framework. But we want to move to talking about, so what about the emotions? Well, when you look at the 3 core presences, you definitely don't see one labeled as an emotional presence. But all of the key foundational scholars like Randy Garrison and Terry Anderson that developed the framework, they have always, all along, said that you should never see the framework as separate parts, and that the elements shouldn't be seen as distinct, but you're encouraged to be creative by considering the presences together and in combination. And that's what we're ultimately going to do today. Sorry, I'm just trying to change the slide. So I wanted to just take a look at what if we broke the model up, and I'm just going to quickly go through what if we broke the model up and actually, dissected the model to begin to think about the model as basically having layers, and starting with the core, which are the design and facilitation inputs, and then moving out towards the measures, which are the learning effectiveness outcomes. And for me, when I was able to pull it apart and look at it this way, it helped me to make much more sense of it, rather than thinking about how would people get to the point of having teaching social and cognitive presence in the environment. Well, how they would get there is from the mutually reinforcing overlaps in the center. So thinking about the learning experience as the core, moving out to what looks like a propeller, and in my mind acts like a propeller, to propel the supporting of discourse, the setting of climate, and the ways that through facilitation and co-facilitation of peers, we can help to both regulate others and regulate our own learning. And then that brings us to the mutually reinforcing overlaps. And then as we move out, the instrument that already exists is the learner self-report, the community, what's often called the community of inquiry survey, where learners rate after a course or during a course experience. And then there's also the objective measures, which are the transcript indicators, where coders actually go through discussion boards and look for indicators of cognitive, social, and teaching presence emerging. So really, I want you to think about this particular slide as we move into practicing together, because this really sets the stage for what we want to do with the tool that we've loaded for this practice session. And really begin to think of COI as both a theoretical and a practical guidance model so that you can design and facilitate your online courses. So as you know, defining emotions is not an easy thing. I can tell you that pretty conclusively, because when I was doing the scoping study before my research, the amount of definitions of emotions is incredible. And then when you layer that on emotions and online learning, it gets even more complex. So let's just, for the sake of moving through this presentation, consider emotions as umbrella concepts that cover both affective, cognitive, and expressive and psychological components, which may or may not cohere over time. And I think the cohere over time part is important, because in my own research, when people are endorsing a particular emotion in community of inquiry learning, they're sometimes endorsing it as only fleeting, saying, yeah, I felt that at first, but then this happened. And so that's really important, because an emotion in the body physiologically is usually dispersed within about 6 seconds. So everything that's helping it to keep going is coming from your cognition. So just a bit about emotions in e-learning. You can see that there's lots of reasons we should pay attention to it. Is particularly all of the advances in neuroscience that are saying that there's such a strong connection between emotions, social functioning, and decision making. And if you were at this morning's presentation, you heard lots being talked about the decision making that goes into complaining and the emotional basis of that. Community of inquiry researchers are realizing that in the early stages of community inquiry, facilitating in a way to increase comfort may increase the indicators of cognitive presence. And socio-emotional variables like engagement, motivation, collaboration are so involved in the learning process. And one of the original studies on emotional presence and community of inquiry concluded with the idea that it's not appropriate to leave emotions as unconscious or unexamined, but we have to think about them in terms of reflective pedagogy and understanding the role of emotions in life and learning. And that really points to the idea of lifelong learning disposition, but also higher education reform. And who do we want to come out of the end of an educational experience? And I know in the K-12 sector, there's a really strong focus on social and emotional learning, but I don't think it should just be, young kids that are getting it. It's important for adults too. It's something we don't talk about enough. And then the last one is that, again, confirming what Shane Bajero said, that those early stages of community inquiry are really important. And I know for myself, when I was first in a community of inquiry, and I think about my peers' reaction to being in a community of inquiry, there was a lot of discomfort. There was a lot of criticism about the instructor in terms of, well, they're not even teaching, they're not even doing this. When really what was happening was they were using a different philosophy of learning. And it was uncomfortable, very uncomfortable for us as learners to move from transmission-based teaching where the instructor was omnipresent to a space where we had to be really self-directed in our own learning and become part of the teaching team for each other. So it's just based on all of that, it is a really worthy research agenda, because the prominence of emotional presence, both as whether it's a distinct presence or whether it's coexisting in the three presences, it can help to refine what we know about learning and establishing climate. And that's where we want to focus by really realizing that the emotion-related processes that are required for anything from skills and knowledge transferred from the school environment to the real world is like an emotional rudder. And I love this metaphor that it is the emotions that are keeping the momentum, keeping the motion going. And that's true when you think about whether it's the emotions underneath motivation itself, or whether it's the curiosity, the engagement, all of those have an emotional base. So let's get into practice. And just to highlight what we're going to do with the practice, I just pulled out that part of the model that I was calling the propeller, to really highlight that we want to focus when you're thinking about establishing a community of inquiry, thinking about what you're going to do to support the discourse, what you're going to do to set the climate, and what you're going to do to regulate learning. And regulate learning, I just want to be clear, doesn't mean control learning or be in any way the judge. It means to use the climate and the discourse to create conditions where people can self-manage their own learning and co-regulate with each other through the discussion prompts. So that helps you to understand that these things don't stand alone. I almost, in my mind, I think of them as kind of spinning, and propelling around the other presences. So Garrison, way back early in the model, said that the focus lies where cognitive and teaching presence overlap, and that the importance of social presence and where it overlaps with teaching presence with setting climate is overlooked. So I didn't want us to overlook it, and I wanted us to think about the emotions as kind of being at the edges. So if we think about supporting discourse, that would include things like finding a balance between when to be involved in the discussion and when to sit back, when to, create situations where there might be fact-based knowledge that needs to happen, but how to let the students find that themselves without being overbearing. It might include staying completely out of the discussion until the end and then doing a summary and a synthesis. It also might include modeling vulnerability and the use of emotions. For regulating learning, we need to know and be really clear that knowledge and transfer are higher when we can sometimes create confusion. And lots of emotions research in online learning unfortunately points to confusion as a bad thing. But there's just as much research that points to confusion as a good thing, because it's a catalyst. It's a catalyst that leads people to explore, look for answers, and get deeper engagement with the new information. And so if we're very purposeful about how we couple cognition and emotion in the reflective prompts that we put in discussion boards, we can help to regulate in some ways. And in setting climate, that means always creating conditions for safe expression, facilitating to help develop relationships within yourself and the students, but also the students to the students. And you're all probably very familiar with student-to-student interaction research. And ways that you're honoring diversity and multi-perspectives. And that can take many, many shapes as you design your course. And then discussion of the evolving course climate. So checking in. Sometimes some of my community of inquiry instructors have asked the class to develop a course rules or rules of engagement, how we're going to be with each other. And then I just want to point out that lots of online or lots of higher education talks about the importance of reflection. And this Malky and Green quote just really puts the idea to place that if we're constantly protecting our comfort zones, then that will be the opposite of getting towards a place of reflection. So I think it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes, and that purposefully as an instructor, creating some gentle discomfort is a good learning tool. So let's, I was going to do a breakout, but there's only the 4 of you. So I think it would be okay for us to just do it in one session, if that's okay with you guys. Yeah. Okay. So was everybody able to grab the self-assessment tool from the?
I haven't yet. I missed that.
It's just in that, if you look at your agenda, it's the first link attached to this session.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you got it? Okay. Oh, awesome. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, so just before I get you to start looking at the self-assessment tool for yourself, I wondered if is there any questions or comments on anything that I presented in terms of the history of the model, the efficacy, and then the really centering of the importance of emotions. Okay, well, I am going to say that you can talk and ask questions at any time, and if everybody would open their mic, I'm just going to explain the tool to you, and then just have you think about what your evidence and indicators in your own pedagogical practice are of each of the items. Now, the first column are exactly from the Community of Inquiry survey, but they're reworded to be from a facilitator's perspective and to include some of the emotional anchors. The next column is where you would rate yourself. Do you do this never, all the way to always? Then we've connected it to where is this coming from in the core model, what presence, but also the little icon there is where the closest connection to the overlap is, and then the effective learning connection. So what are you trying to do? And when we think about regulation of itself, when we're talking about emotional regulation that contributes to learning, it's about up-regulating those helpful emotions and down-regulating the ones that can block learning. So you'll see that there's some suggestions in there, but that's not conclusive. You may go through this tool and realize, well, I'm also trying to increase this other thing because of my content, my context, or the way I am as a facilitator. So you don't need to go through and do the whole assessment now, but I wonder if you could each maybe just pick one, because I'm restructuring what the plan was because we have a smaller group, but if you could just pick one of them and just offer some solutions, some suggestions, or so pick one you feel really strong about, or pick one that you would like some help with and ask others what they might contribute in terms of evidence indicators or their own pedagogical practice. Maybe May, could I call on you to maybe pick one you feel strong about and one that maybe you would like to improve?
Sure, I'm just trying to pick one. Hang on.
Okay. I just saw your mic was open, so I.
This is Angela. I can offer one up, maybe.
Awesome. Thanks, Angela.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm looking at this one that says, I facilitate online discussions in a way that helps students appreciate different perspectives. So sometimes I will, and my classes are online async. So in the discussions, sometimes I will create a debate where they have to take, whether they agree with the position or not, they've got to take that one and mount their strategy and then argue it at some point during the week with the pro team versus the con team sort of idea. And then one of the other things I do, because I'm in the discussion in there with them also, is that when I see disparate kind of views, I'll try to connect the two of them and say, hey, Joe, how does what you're thinking, you know, compare or align or not align with what Mary's thinking. Is that the kind of thing you're looking for, Deborah?
That's absolutely it. And I mean, you said you said such great things there. One, the way you were supporting the discourse was right from the initial prompt, right? So initially you're saying, I'm going to create a very particular cognitive thing here. And then secondly, you said that I'm going to also, not only am I going to synthesize, I might then scaffold it by creating another question, which is, yeah, that's absolutely. It hits so much of the model just in that description.
Awesome.
I think it's also a really good example of why it's hard to pick the model apart, because just in your story, you've hit so many parts of it. So that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would pick the one, I facilitate online discussions in a way that helps students appreciate different perspectives. And I think that's really important to give a really clear space for that in the course, not just sort of sort of amongst reviews and so on and being, yeah, that's good, but actually have honor that space where you actually have a discussion with people and pull out their different perspectives and then punctuate each one with some kind of an appreciation statement or encourage other people to do it, but basically honoring a space for an appreciative discourse. So I would add.
That's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, and just, I mean, that fits with the setting, the caring climate, but it also supports with regulating learning, right? Because you've made the space.
Mm-hmm.
You've allowed the place for it to happen. So again, good example. And again, you can see why the overlaps are so important.
So I'll share. So I am a supervisor for editing and copyright. So I don't actually design the courses, but we can certainly suggest as editors, what materials to use or, if we see that there's something that might be exclusive to some students and that kind of thing. So, and then the other part of this for me is that I'm always looking at it in terms of providing this environment as for my team, because even though we don't have direct influence on designing the courses, and sometimes it's sort of dicey with instructional designers and faculty and we don't want to step on anyone's toes and that kind of thing, but I'm still always looking at it as we are a community of inquiry within ourselves, and I want to encourage that as a leader. I want us to be always looking at things reflectively, and I want us to be suggesting things that that help students, but ultimately recognize their own strengths in my team, so their own strengths and weaknesses. So there were a number of things in here that I felt like I would apply if I was an instructional designer, but also I would apply as a team leader as well. So my actions reinforce the development of a sense of community among course participants. So I hope that I do that in terms of creating a climate of, all of us feeling free and open to discuss and to disagree from time to time, and also to feel that they belong and that they have an important voice in the process of curriculum development. So I don't know if I can pick just one because I appreciate all of them. So I'd see it more as a whole. So I don't know if that's really what you're looking for, but it was really hard for me to go through and just pick one. So
no, that's completely fine. And again, as you were talking, you were the regulating learning one used to be called selecting content. And so you took it way back to the origin of the model, and really the content you select has a real foundation about what's going to happen in terms of setting climate and regulating, and even the supporting discourse, because you can only talk about what's before you there, right? No, that's a perfect answer. I think the point we wanted to make about emotions in online learning, as well as about community of inquiry, is that it all overlaps and layers on each other. So another really good example of that. Thanks, Danny.
I'm not a very fast reader. I'm dyslexic, so I decided I'd start at the bottom of the list, assuming that people wouldn't pick stuff from the bottom because they'd be starting from the top. And while I'd sort of echo the fact that there's many things in here that I hope that I do. I noticed, just second to the bottom here, I create to ensure that online and in-person discussions can help learners to develop a sense of collaboration. In my courses, that's kind of something that I touch on right from the introductory video, that while hopefully they'll learn some stuff from me, that the course is all about collaboration, and as a result, the discussion boards are really important because of the fact that they'll learn from each other's approaches and different perspectives on things just as much as they'll learn from me. I teach in a sort of a digital storytelling space, and so that very much one person can take sort of one of my ideas and apply it in a much different way than another person, and often it'll be things that I haven't approached that way of doing things before myself. And so that's kind of key in my courses, is to really encourage them to collaborate with each other. And part of that too is I get them to kind of do 2 stars and a wish for each other as they're building, to so that they can also kind of get each other's perspectives on their creations.
Awesome. Erica, I'm a big fan of 2 stars and a wish, but I'm thinking maybe not everybody knows what it is. So would you say a little more?
Yeah, it's just an approach to kind of giving constructive feedback. And even though I'm using it now with adults, it was introduced to me from somebody who was doing sort of more, kind of children's based education, where it was just a sort of a more positive way of approaching the idea of giving feedback. So 2 stars being 2 things that you really like that they're doing and how they're approaching something, and a wish being something that you would prefer was a bit different.
Awesome. And Erica, I was introduced to 2 stars and a wish for emotional intelligence training.
Oh,
so
nice.
it really fits with the topic that we're discussing.
If I could maybe share one of the uncertainties, or I guess concerns, not concerns, but things that I would love to happen, but I also worry. So I think I have a good grasp in terms of how to develop an instructor-student relationship where students can feel comfortable sharing their emotions, their concerns, those types of things. But also kind of cognizant that still kind of maintains this power dynamic that I'd like to not exist. But then also, like you said kind of at the beginning, Deborah, people are uncomfortable with their emotions. And so trying not to force this whole kind of sharing of emotions with their learning with each other. I think that's where I really have a hard time, not pushing them too far, but trying to support and encourage that in a way that doesn't alienate anyone if they don't want to do that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. absolutely. And I'm going to tie back to something Erica said to just explore that a little bit. Part of what makes getting started in a community of inquiry uncomfortable is because it's so different than what you're raised with for most people. Although I'm hearing now more K-12 is doing community-based kind of things as they're learning. So it may be that eventually colleges and universities will be accepting young people who are quite familiar with collaborative learning. But right now, there's generally a discomfort. There's also that power dynamic that we're never going to get rid of right now. Although, I don't know if you were in this session before where the gentleman was talking about his online essay scoring system, and what he was saying about how he doesn't mark his students until the very end. They mark just through the electronic. It was a tool that was really, I think, focusing on the idea that education is about mastery, not about being judged by a power. and so I really, really loved it. But I think you're right. So in the discussion prompt, it doesn't have to say, tell me what you think and what you feel, right? Because yes, absolutely. There's lots of research that says even there's gender separation with how likely you are to say what you feel. But you can gently prompt. So if someone is staying really highly cognitive, something as simple as, where do you think that thought comes from, can put them into a gentle way of exploring the, the foundational belief that's connected to that thought, the history, maybe where, just where it originates from in their meaning perspectives that they may have grown up with, can get them closer to the emotions. The second way is by modeling it yourself. So by saying, or highlighting somebody who's already modeled it, but by saying something like, I used to believe this, but then this happened and I moved from this, and that was an uncomfortable place for me. So doing it slowly, doing it gently, but I want to tie back to what Erica said, that she pre-teaches what she's going to do. And I think if anything's coming out of my own research is that we have to be very clear with students when we're using a community of inquiry right from the beginning. So just by saying, you're going to experience this way, and this is what I'm going to expect, and this is where, it reduces the tension about the difference in the pedagogy and can open the avenues for exploration. Thanks, Kelly.
Awesome, thank you.
About Erica, mic's open. You want to add something?
Oh no, that was unintentionally. I actually thought I'd close my mic because so yeah, no, that was unintentionally open.
Okay.
But I'm enjoying this. Thank you. It really is a discussion that I think is just so important, and we need to have a lot more, because I know, I mean, just myself personally, if I feel that I'm safe in an educational space, and that the instructor honestly wants to kind of hear like responses and input from me, and then when I give that input, it is it's accepted in a I mean, they might not agree with me, but it's accepted in a positive way. I'm much more likely to be an engaged learner within the process, versus when I've been in situations, I can sometimes be a bit outspoken and sometimes be a bit of the devil's advocate that'll approach, offer, if I see, a point of view that is valid, that hasn't that isn't getting acknowledged in a space, I will sometimes bring it up. And when I've seen that that's resulted in me getting attacked by the instructor, which has happened, it creates an environment where I'm more likely to close off, and I'm less likely to put validity in what's being taught to me.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, we have to be honest that not all instructors, I mean, some instructors are very, very happy staying with Sage on the Stage transmission-based model because that's what's comfortable to them. So not all even when students are sometimes ready for community of inquiry, not all instructors are, and we have to be very, very honest about that. I don't teach in a university setting, but I teach in workforce development in addictions and mental health. And I spend the first 2 weeks mostly just highlighting people's contributions to get them to a space where they understand it is going to be a safe space to say what they think, to say what they feel, to wrestle with the content in a way that maybe it's not even set up in the classroom to wrestle with it that way, to add to the content. I spent a lot of time before the content saying this is what this learning experience is going to be like. But yeah, I feel for you with the being attacked. I've seen it as well. It's not everybody is ready to believe that the world will be a better place if everybody has a voice, right? And not everybody wants to believe that you can learn as much from your classmates as you can from the instructor of record, right? So it's, yeah, there's a tension there for absolutely sure. So we have about 4 minutes left. I want to just say thank you for even though we're a small group, I think we're a committed group and good discussion. I hope that you'll use the tool in a more fulsome way after the session, and that maybe you got some ideas from some of your peers here, and that maybe you got the idea that this was a very meta way to do community of inquiry in a community of inquiry way. And that you'll maybe practice with the tool. And if as you're going through it and you do anything with it and you'd like to share it with Dr. Cleveland and I, it's our hope that eventually we'll do a lot more with it eventually. But I'll just open, I mean, any of you can open your mics if you want to say just a few words of goodbye or any questions.
I just wanted to say on the punctuate your discussion about the discomfort of change. I mean, look at us here on Zoom after a year. I mean, so many people are now comfortable with it. It was just, I have a friend who was a therapist who had never been near technology and was forced to go to Zoom, and he likes it so much that he's now made it his way of giving therapy, finds it better than face-to-face, amazingly.
That's so, I've heard that from every single mental health practitioner that I work with closely.
Really?
And they're, instead of having the cameras on, they're opening the drawing board so that people can explore while they're talking. And I mean, I think lots of people like to think of face-to-face education as the golden standard, when really, yeah, whose voices are always being left out. I certainly know that I never raised my hand.
Exactly.
Not once, in a room
exactly.
full of
and in an online classroom, every cameo is the same size. You're not the back of the class or the front of the class. You're all, on one screen, provided it isn't too huge a course, of course. But just on that disruption of change, and humans are so quickly adaptable. But recently I had a conversation with my daughter, who is just a phenomenal mother, involved mom. I said, when I read Children the Challenge, when I was raising you, it was like a foreign language compared to the way I had been raised, right? It was just, I was saying the words and they were so awkward and so forced that I wondered how they would ever be natural.
Right.
Whereas for her, it's just second nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're hitting on some things in there, May, that that sort of I was really amazed at when I started teaching online. My beginning of teaching online was long before the pandemic, and my courses are asynchronous. So so people are not actually online on a Zoom, you know, call together. I was quite resistant to teaching online initially, and eventually I came to the conclusion that the reality was I kind of needed to move my courses online because it wasn't sustainable to have to be in the community of the school for a 3-hour course each week, sort of thing. And one of the things that I've discovered that I absolutely love is that fact that I'm actually getting to know some of my students better in the online environment than I am in an in-person environment, because of the fact that there's no fear with there's like not the same fear with sharing and with kind of opening up, because you don't have all those eyes looking at you.
Absolutely. That's
And
an
just the
awesome,
physical bubbles.
yeah,
Different.
that's an awesome and poignant way to end, is just realizing that it's not maybe either or face to face, that online learning can sometimes be. And that was one of Garrison's philosophies when he first developed the model, was that online learning can be better than. So it sounds like you've each experienced that. So it is 12, and I'll say thank you for coming, but I do understand there is a room where you can continue the discussion if you guys would like to do that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for your fantastic presentation. You did an awesome job, even though your co-presenter bailed on you.
I like to believe the technology failed her.
I'm sure that's the problem. But thank you very much.
Awesome. I'll just leave my contact details and Marty's contact details for the last slide there. And thank you, everybody.